But I'd like to look back on the first day of the feast. In his sermon that day, Mr. Botha said something that was very meaningful to me because it provided me with a connection to my past. He asked, "Why are you here?" Well, that brought back memories. If you have attended the Feast of Tabernacles for any significant length of time, you may have heard Herbert Armstrong ask that very same question. Now, I attended several feasts with Mr. Armstrong, so I heard it pretty frequently. And it's always good to hear it because that first day of the feast is really a very special event for a number of reasons. For one thing, it marks the anniversary of the dedication of Solomon's temple that he built in Jerusalem. That was the day that God's glory filled the temple, and it abided there until shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, when Mr. Armstrong asked that question, "Why are you here?" he generally wanted us to think about what had led us to come to that place. Why had we traveled some distance to meet with like-minded believers to observe a commanded festival? Now, that's certainly one level of understanding for that question about why we are here today. And the answer to that, in some ways, is pretty obvious. It's because God commanded it. Not only did he command it, he told us how to finance our expenses along the way for attending the feast. But there are other ways that you could understand that question. More lasting, more enduring reasons than just a once-a-year festival. When we ask ourselves that question, "Why am I here?" then it could be a question about why we are alive, why we exist, why are we on earth? And I think that probably the first man to ask himself that question was Adam. You know, Adam walked in the Garden of Eden with God and talked with God, and I can imagine Adam turning to God during one of those walks and saying, "Why am I here?" And I suspect that God answered that question very plainly and directly to Adam, if he didn't, in fact, just volunteer it as part of Adam's instruction about why he had been created. Now, I don't think Adam was the last man to ask that question of God. I think it's something that we all do at some point in our lives. We ask ourselves, why are we here? We may expand that to ask, well, now that I am here, what should I be doing? And further, after I have been here and done what I did, what is that leading to? Well, King Solomon asked those questions and answered them in great detail. He wrote a report on it. We have it as the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, some biblical scholars will say that Ecclesiastes is the question that the rest of the books of the Bible are written to answer. And I think there's some validity to that. And that makes Ecclesiastes a very appropriate and traditional book to study at this time of the year. In many Jewish synagogues, the book of Ecclesiastes is read on the Sabbath that falls during the Feast of Tabernacles. It's one of a series of books known as the Festival Scrolls or the Megillot that are traditionally read primarily in Ashkenazi synagogues on certain holy days. In addition to the book of Ecclesiastes, the other books of the Megillot are the Song of Songs, which is read on the Sabbath that falls during the days of unleavened bread, the book of Ruth, which is read on Pentecost, the book of Lamentations, which is read on the 9th of Ab, which is a traditional day of commemorating the disasters that have befallen the Jewish people down through the centuries. And finally, Esther, which is read on the day of Purim. Now, those books are not actually read. They are actually sung by cantors in the synagogue. Now, after King Solomon consolidated his power, God appeared to him in a dream and asked him what he wanted. It's as if God were giving him one wish that he would grant to Solomon. Now, recognizing the challenges that he was going to face as a ruler over God's people, Solomon was humble enough to understand that he had significant responsibilities for which he would be accountable to God. So Solomon asked God to give him a good understanding mind so that he could distinguish between good and evil. And God was so pleased with Solomon's humility and his lack of selfishness in making that request that God said to him in 1 Kings chapter 3, it's 1 Kings chapter 3, he would make Solomon the wisest and most discerning man ever to live at any time. So we frequently hear Solomon referred to as the wisest man who ever lived. God designated him as such. Now, not only was God going to make him wise and understanding, he was going to give Solomon the things that he didn't ask for himself. God was going to give Solomon riches and honor that would exceed those of all other kings of his era. Now let's begin our consideration of the book of Ecclesiastes as a festival book by identifying the ways in which Solomon applied the wisdom and discernment that God had blessed him with to find out why he was here. First, Solomon wanted to be enlightened. He wanted to understand. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 13, that's Ecclesiastes 1, verse 13, Solomon wrote, "And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It's an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind." When Solomon said that he sought and searched out by wisdom all that was done under heaven, that covers a vast expanse of territory. Ecclesiastes records Solomon's observations of everything from weather cycles to political science and all points in between. Solomon found that the pursuit of knowledge by itself does not make a person better in a moral sense, nor does it fill him with satisfaction. But some people still spend their lives gathering and accumulating facts, but still failing to grasp and understand the truth. Solomon cautioned his readers in the last chapter of Ecclesiastes that of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Now, the Apostle Paul, who was himself a brilliant intellectual man, paraphrased Solomon's conclusion about the search for knowledge when he wrote that some are ever learning, yet never able to come to an understanding of the truth. Second, Solomon wanted to understand how he should live his life by experiencing the pleasure of following his natural desires. He said to himself in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, that's Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it's mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart to know how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their lives." In other words, Solomon was going to do what he felt like. He was going to do what his emotions drove him to do. All the while, though, he retained the wisdom that God had blessed him with. And once again, Paul has restated something that Solomon concluded in Galatians 5, chapter 5, a chapter that you're probably familiar with because it's a contrast of the works of the flesh as opposed to the works of the Spirit. Paul wrote, "Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like that. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God." Now we know definitely that Solomon did indulge in some of these. He indulged in sensuality and idolatry and drunkenness, and he may well have indulged in many of those others. Now, they are generally self-explanatory as to what they actually are. Sensuality is just doing the things that you do to please your body. You pamper yourself with food, with drink, or with leisure, or exciting your senses. But you might wonder why rivalries, dissension, and divisions are considered works of the flesh. Those are actually the results of the lust for power, and that's one of the strongest drives that we humans have. And that lust for power is exhibited in things like political parties, even scholarly debates, and religious denominations. Solomon concluded that such pursuits of pleasure, whether they were physical, emotional, or intellectual, was also vanity, a waste of time, because it would not lead to a life that was pleasing either to the self or to God. In this lifetime, the pursuit of those pleasures can lead to frustration, to self-destructive behavior, and addictions. Indulging in the pleasures of the flesh truly is vanity and a striving after wind because it leads to the second death. Third, Solomon wanted to see where his life was leading by achieving great things. Since God had promised to give him honor and riches more than any other king of his time, Solomon set about putting those things into place on his own initiative. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning in verse 4, that's Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, Solomon wrote, "I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than anyone who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces." And one of the things that Solomon wanted to do with his accomplishments and his wealth was to help the poor and the oppressed. Now, that's a very noble humanitarian pursuit. He wanted to be a benevolent king, just as he had seen God being a benevolent king. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, it's Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verses 1 and 2, Solomon wrote, "Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them." Now, Solomon's accomplishments were significant. He engaged in architecture, construction, public works projects, including the building of the temple that was famous for its glory and prominence. Planting forests, assembling large workforces to build those things, accumulating wealth and wanting to improve the lives of those who had not been so blessed as he was or who had suffered misfortune. And those are all activities that God does want mankind to engage in. But Solomon's humanitarian charitable motivations were provoked because he saw that the oppression of the common people by the powerful was a pervasive condition of human nature. It's just human nature at work. The powerful are naturally inclined to oppress the poor and the weak for their own advantage. And human nature doesn't change over time. 1,000 years later, during the life of Jesus, the religious leaders of Judah, the Sanhedrin, exercised both religious and governmental authority and power. And Jesus strongly condemned them for the way that they oppressed the common people. Matthew wrote in chapter 23, it's Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 7. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, and so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi or teachers by others." And I think it's very easy for us to see similar oppression in our society today. Too many of our politicians and judges and religious and educational leaders love to have recognition and acclaim. They love to promote and flaunt their credentials. Senators and congressmen are always referred to honorable. Judges are referred to as Your Honor. Scholars are referred to as doctors. And they like to have their certifications and degrees made well known, whether they're earned or just honorary. And they like to have the privileges and perquisites that go along with their positions. And they also have immunities that they reserve to themselves because of their positions. There are impenetrable good old boy networks that you just can't seem to break into. And lawmakers will approve laws and regulations that they have not actually read, but expect that other people will obey them, or they'll get tied up in interminable administrative procedures or court proceedings. Theologians will develop and promote false theologies to try to promote themselves and their positions. Now, these self-seeking and self-promoting attitudes are just as alive today as they were at the time of Jesus, and Solomon's kingdom probably had a similar kind of bureaucratic, deeply entrenched, deep state that took advantage of the weak and the powerless. Now, it would appear that Solomon led a frustrating life, using the wisdom that had been given to him by God to search out the reason why he was alive and how he should live and what the end result of that life would be. He found only disappointment and disillusionment. He concluded that life was essentially meaningless and filled with vanity. But in the end, God actually led him to a transcendental conclusion that was profound by its very simplicity. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 12 to 14, it's Ecclesiastes 12, verses 12 to 14, Solomon wrote, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, whether good or evil." Now, Solomon came to this conclusion after all things had been heard, all the evidence had been examined, all the witnesses had testified, and all the experts had given their opinions. And Solomon condensed the results of his questioning and searching down to two very clear and simple conclusions as to why we are here. First, we are here to fear God. No life will ever experience meaning without God. Since God does exist, he is our ultimate reality. He created us for a reason. That's why we are here. If we are valuable to him, that's what we are worth. What he says is right is absolutely right, and what he says is wrong is absolutely wrong. Now, we may be free moral agents with the freedom to make decisions, but that doesn't mean that we can choose what is right and what is wrong. That's left to God. God makes the rules. The question is, will he enforce those rules? Will God hold us accountable for the decisions that we make? And the answer is yes. God certainly will hold us accountable. It's as if most people know instinctively that one day they're going to be accountable for the things that they've done in this life. God wants us to know him on his own terms and conditions and to hold him in awe and worship him the way that he wants to be worshiped. Second, Solomon tells us to obey God. Jesus said that all the commandments could be reduced to two clear and simple phrases. First, love God with all your heart, and second, love your neighbor as yourself. If we live in accordance with those two commandments, then our lives will begin to show us that we are not living in vanity and meaningless, but rather that God has a purpose for our lives. Solomon wrote in chapter 3, verse 11, that God had put the concept of eternity into man's heart. Eventually, most people will confront the reality of eternity. We will recognize that life may continue after death, and we'll wonder what impact what we do in this life will have on our life in eternity. God wants his people to know that decisions and actions of our lives will determine the conditions of our eternal existence. In other words, life prepares us for eternity, for good or for bad. Jesus confirmed this when he said in Mark chapter 8, it's Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 34, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And after Jesus has come in glory with the holy angels, he describes life in the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21. That's Revelation 21, beginning in verse 1. John wrote, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away.'" And at that time, in the heavenly Jerusalem, I think that one of the things that may have passed away will be the curiosity that we have about why we are here. Because we will know, and we may never be asked that question again.